Good morning, class. This is your teacher, Mr. Cruz. I'm sitting here with my morning cup of coffee, ready to start the day. I wanted to make this quick little video just to, well, put us into the EdPuzzle mode because we haven't used EdPuzzle before in our class, but I also wanted to talk a little bit about Chapter 16 from the Scarlet Letter. Anything could happen in this video because I'm taking care of my daughter who's sitting over there and who is currently right now eating some breakfast, but she could throw it on the ground and she could poop or she could do anything, and I'd have to run over and stop this video. So just be aware of that and give me a little bit of grace, I guess. But jumping into chapter 16, before we do get into that, I wanted to discuss a little bit about this, especially in chapter 16. It's going to be a prominent theme, which is this return to nature, specifically important to romantic literature, or the romantic period. And so the significance of the return to nature, I want us to think a little bit beyond just returning back to physical elements of nature, for instance, like going back to the forest, for instance, even though in chapter 16, that is literally quite what they do, right? But think about the romantics as using nature as a metaphor, as a euphemism for something that was more primal, something a little bit more important to like human existence or human experience, right? Which is, I think, and I'm just going to speculate here, I think is referring more to freedom than anything, right? The freedom of the human versus the constraints of a culture or civilization, right? So thinking of nature as a return to one's own nature within the natural sphere of the earth, versus being in a cultural place or a cultural center like, and I'm just going to use our own context like Fort Lauderdale or Miami, or well, the only one who might get that is Monty, but those who operate in a city environment or New York City, for example, you could look at a place like LA, for instance, that way, where this city environment really leads to all these sort of social pressures, right? Societal pressures, gender expectations, all these different things that happen or occur in a city center because there's so many people, so much population that's dictating the things that we do, even if it's not necessarily blatant or outright. For instance, I go outside and I have to meet an expectation of the people around me, right? Those expectations may be in my head, right? They use that expression, that keeping up with the Joneses, right? That's an expression of culture, right? Of the ways in which culture's dictating to us, even unspoken, right? My neighbor doesn't have to come over and say, hey, by the way, Mr. Cruz, I don't know if you know this, but you know, that beat up 1999 Toyota that you got in your driveway, that's not going to be good for the neighborhood. Nobody needs to tell me that. It's the fact that nobody else has a beaten up 1999 Toyota in their driveway. That's dictating to me a kind of pressure, right, to keep up with the Joneses. Those sorts of pressures, I think, are the kinds of pressures that the Romantic period is really looking into. In addition to that, though, I'm going to add this notion of freedom. And put it in a religious context. We do, of course, go to a Christian school, so I think it's really important for us to really pierce what Hawthorne and some of the other Romantic writers are doing, which is this notion of freedom, but freedom from the constraints of organized religious practices, right? And I don't think Hawthorne's saying like, you know, religious practices are bad or that the church is bad necessarily. But I think that during this time, what you saw was a formalism that didn't necessarily always pretend to practice toward the poor, practice towards those who are oppressed. You see in this time, for instance, I think we spoke about this during Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, where abolitionists begin to really start to, like William Wilberforce, for instance, who begin to stand up in Parliament and begin to talk about slavery outright, like openly, and for the first time, he begins to call for a looking into this phenomena, right? And it's not as though nobody ever thought about it before, or that there were no abolitionists before. It's just that to do so in the openness of the day and to speak about it in these kinds of negative terms gave the abolitionists the fuel to be able to think about slavery in this new way, right? Or to think about how culture can move beyond slavery, right, in a different format, maybe for negative or for positive. In the positives being that to abolish slavery, in the negative to be other forms of perhaps exploitation. But again, culture again, and I think a romantic writer like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who wrote about this dichotomy or this binary between nature versus culture, culture has a real sense of adaptation. It's always able to adapt to our needs and desires and wants and all the things that we that are inhabiting our affections, right? The things that we love, and that's could be a great thing about culture. It's one of the things. Art is a part of culture, and that's wonderful. But I think one of the things that some of the romantic writers like Rousseau or like someone like maybe Hawthorne, for instance, would say like nature doesn't have the property of change insofar as nature is reflected in the desires or affections of those things which inhabit nature, right? Like, for example, a bird doesn't have a desire, for instance, and then all of a sudden affect the entirety of nature. That's not how it works. Nature operates on on the commands of God, so to speak, right? And so nature continues, even though yes, it does change. Like things grow and they die, and there is a kind of flux within nature. But it's not the same as culture, which changes on the whims and desires of the people that inhabit that culture. You see what I'm saying? And dependent upon the place that the people there reside in, that culture can change. Okay? So when we think about freedom, we're thinking about nature as something solid, something that I can rely on. I go to nature and I'm ravished by God's creation, and I'm ravished by the fact that these things are not going to turn on me or going to exploit me in quite the same way as perhaps a factory owner might, right? And it's interesting because a lot of people look at someone like Marx, for example, as he is a romantic writer in this capacity, and then they'll look at him as like the founder of this like freedom from work kind of movement. But actually, it's Rousseau who is one of the probably first romantic writers who really step on the scene to talk about nature versus culture. It's Rousseau who, in The Social Contract, talks about this sense of freedom from work, moving back into nature. He also wrote a book called Emile, or On Education. And obviously, you all know I study education, so this is something kind of like I think about all the time. Emile is about a story slash a kind of discourse on pedagogy or teaching or learning and how that works itself out. Should it be placed in the school, or should we just kind of leave the child in the middle of nature to kind of grow for themselves? You could look at Pearl as a kind of Emile figure who really raises herself in many ways. Because it's nature that begins to nurture her, right? In this book, yes, we know that she does learn language. So, for example, we remember earlier in the book she learns from the New England Primer. We know that she learns from the Westminster Confession of Faith, and so she's very familiar with these sorts of things that you might learn. And we talked about the Old Deluder's Law earlier this year. So we know that she's at least learning comparable to the things that her peers are learning out in the town, but it's really nature that nurtures her. And this is what Rousseau talks about in Emile, is the sense in which we are always already, and I'm using that phrase always already to mean that it's always happening. There's never a point in which we stop learning, right? So this notion that we learn in school versus learning out in nature is something Emil kind of troubles a bit, and I think Hawthorne does as well, where look at us now in the situation where I'm here using this instructional tool to then provide you with some sort of instruction, but you're all at home, and what is it that this virus, what is it that it's teaching you? What is the sense in which that we're all entrapped within or quarantined in our homes? What is that teaching you about maybe your own desires or your own wants or the things that you wanted when you were outside of this environment? What is it that going on maybe politically, maybe economically? What is all these things? What are all these things teaching you about how things operated beforehand? And was it good? Was it bad? These sorts of things, I think, are what the Romantic writers would say is your own free choices to make based on your own sense of reason, right? Which is a very important thing for the Romantic writers. But not just reason in this like logical sort of sense. Reason in this very affective sense, right? Like how you feel based on the things that make sense or don't make sense, okay? And that's important, okay? Because sense isn't always this very, very logical. You could use sense in this inverted way. Sense can also be intuition, and we talked about that in terms of Romantic writing. Intuition, very important. Intuition, something that it is a sense in which I feel a certain way about a certain topic, or I look at the way somebody is treated, and maybe it's very negatively, right? And my intuition as a human may be to help another human who is being treated poorly. And there was no logic that got me to that conclusion, right? Unless you want to, use some sort of like, well, I am a human and I am made in the image of God, and they're human and they are made in the image of God, and therefore I should help them. Okay, that may be a logical conclusion, but you had a couple of presuppositions within that logic. Number one, that you're made in the image of God, which I think that by the Romantic period, they probably would have looked at that presupposition and said, you're maybe, when I say presupposition, I'm saying you're using things within that logic that maybe it may need to be cut out a bit or reduced a bit, because the truth is that we don't know logically that we're made in the image of God. I think the Romantic writers probably would have said that, even if they were Christian, right? Like that, this is part of the cultural ethos of the time. Okay, so I'm saying all this to say that this nature versus culture dichotomy is one of the things that happens as they both go, both being Hester and Dimmesdale, but also Pearl's there too, right? But I'm trying to use sort of binaries here. Dimmesdale and Hester both with Pearl go into the forest. And you see here that as Dimmesdale leaves culture and goes back to nature, he sees himself as what he is, right? And it's not necessarily the same picture Rousseau gives of us leaving culture and going back into nature and being these good people, right? Because, of course, we are naturally good, right? And naturally free. Rousseau has that very famous line that I've used a couple times, which is that man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. And the everywhere in which we are in chains is because we are entrapped in these cultural spheres that we are enchained to. Now we need to cut off those chains and move back into the place where we can be free. But here's the interesting thing that Hawthorne says, is that Dimmesdale is, even when he has cut himself off from those cultural centers, moved into nature, and literally he's moved into nature at this point, he's not necessarily free in the kind of way that you might think of freedom, right? And I think Hawthorne's making a really important point here, which is that freedom doesn't necessarily look like I am liberated from everything and I'm just free from every single responsibility, and the things in which I care about, they don't necessarily matter to me. That's not what freedom is for Hawthorne, at least my interpretation. Okay, it's not as though Dimsdale is sitting there and saying, "Man, now I could just be free to run away and it'll be great." No, he goes out there and actually he sees more of his responsibility, which is why he does a very interesting symbol, or at least a symbolic act, which is that he clutches his heart, right? He clutches his heart. And by doing so, it's a kind of symbol for us. It's a metaphor for us to see that he's still pained. In fact, he's more pained about his responsibility to Hester, his responsibility to Pearl, his responsibility to the town, right? As their minister who have entrusted him towards spiritual things. And so he clutches his heart and he sees himself as a man that, despite all the negative associations he has with himself, still extends grace. Does not, usually, you see this a lot of times when you meet some people where if somebody feels a sense of guilt or feels a sense of distraughtness with themselves, for instance, they will then project those feelings towards other people. That happens sometimes. Where, for example, if I do something and I feel guilty, and somebody asks me a question, but then I perceive the question to be sort of like that they're trying to get something out of me, right? So I turn it on them and I say like, well, what about you, right? And so by doing that, I'm projecting my feelings upon them. He doesn't do that. Dimsdale is actually very gracious in the way he handles people. But as we'll see in chapter 17, maybe not as much towards Hester. But we'll get there maybe in a little while. So what's the significance of the clutching then? For me, I think the significance of the clutching is to, number one, kind of physically put a remembrance of embodiment towards the book, right? When we talk about these like very abstract ideas of nature versus culture, sometimes they can be so abstract and so thoughtful, they remove us from the physicality of these ideas, the tension of these ideas. And I think, again, my interpretation, I think Dimsdale's clutching of his heart is, or rather his chest, is a kind of embodied sense of this tension between nature and culture, of this tension between freedom, this tension between his own sense of shame and guilt. To see that embodied within his clutch is to say not just that he feels bad about it, right? Like you do something and you feel bad about it. It's that by not doing anything at all, in a very real sense, by kind of remaining in the dark about this, he no longer can perform the necessary duties of a minister in these sorts of righteous ways that he has been called to do. And he can no longer serve the people of the town in the same sort of way. It's moved beyond just him feeling bad. It's pushed itself. You could see the progression of Dimsdale throughout the entirety of the novel, from the beginning of the story all the way until now. Remember, at the very beginning of the story, Dimsdale goes up to Hester to ask her who the father is in front of everybody. Okay? So, I'd say feel bad for Dimsdale, because I kind of feel bad for Dimsdale. I have a sense of, I can sympathize, while at the same time holding in tension the fact that, or maybe holding in a paradox, the sense in which he doesn't really speak up. He doesn't really say what he's supposed to say, and he lets Hester take the fall for like a long time, for years. And this is important because in what ways can this sin, and I think it is a sin, in what ways can this sin begin to change Dimsdale's heart? And in what way can it erode? I'm using a very important word, erode, or I'm going to use another word, deform, right? Deform your heart. And all these are educative terms, by the way, because I'm using this same sense of dichotomy with nature versus culture in the book Emile that I talked about with Rousseau. In what ways can you be deformed by this sin, which has now changed Dimsdale, right? He's not the black man that is referred to in chapter 16, right? Or is he? Well, I don't think so. But in a certain way, whatever has been described about this black man, and we know in the story that the description of a black man isn't necessarily a racial description, although I think a reading of this text can include that, right? The certain ways in which the fear of someone who's darker coming in your midst, right? This is one of the big discourses that are going to come in the next coming years as the Romantic period continues to move forward. But in this case, whatever the description of the black man is a sort of devilish one. And we think, up until this point, we think it's probably Chillingworth, right? Probably, we think. But the minister who's struggling with his own sin, I think, can probably be pointed to. And you could look at him as a kind of a symbol of this, the way in which we all embody this devilish figure, right? Because sin is a part of the human condition. And that's an interesting, I think, dynamic. Because the early church fathers didn't see sin, and I think I talked about this in class, didn't see sin as, or at least evil, right? This concept of evil as a thing. And when I say that, it's like, look, I'm going to take a sip of my coffee. Okay, you see this coffee mug? That's a thing, right? It has a kind of ontological status. I can see it, I can hold it, I can drink from it. Man, that's great in the morning. So I can drink from it, I can look around it and see the backside of it. So it has a kind of object status, right? Like my glasses. This has a sense of status, right? Object status, right? So I can hold it, I can see it. There are, and it's not just my sensations, right? It's being held right now on the table, and so the table, another thing, is holding a thing, right? So all these things, right? We could say for them to have existence in some kind of way, some capacity. But evil, for Augustine, for instance, in the early Augustine, in the Confessions, evil doesn't necessarily have a status of existence in the same kind of way, right? In fact, evil is a lack, right? It's a lack of the goodness, and goodness coming from God, of course. And so wherever God is not, right, or wherever goodness is not, that is where evil is. But evil is not in the same way that God is, or that I am, right? It's a very weird dynamic, because evil, as far as Hawthorne's text, evil is embodied by a thing, the black man, right? And I think it's interesting, partly because of the fact that early in the book, we get a sense in which the narrator, the surveyor rather, who we meet in the Custom House, he writes of his early Puritan ancestors that they were stiff-necked people who were very strict and who were very always looking for some kind of evil in their midst, right? But how much further have we come with this narrator who sees evil embodied by a thing, right? The black man, whoever that is, right? How far removed is that from seeing a witch, right? Seeing evil embodied in another person, in a thing, right? How many times have you heard maybe a parent or maybe a grandparent or something talk about technology as an evil? Like what I'm trying to say is that Hawthorne is incredibly not only human, but I think American in this kind of way, is that we see evil embodied. And I don't think every culture has this within their cultural ethos. America specifically has a sense of evil embodied in these particular ways. We're very good at scapegoating and sort of pushing evil onto a thing, right? And to say that is the embodiment of that of the evil that I'm talking about. So all these things, as we move into chapter 17, before they meet, right? And you see at the very end of chapter 16 that Pearl sees Dimsdale, and Hester sees Dimsdale, and she says, "That isn't the black man, that's the minister," right? And they both stay, and you see this last scene at the end of chapter 16 where Dimsdale is still clutching his heart, right? I'm going to finish off there, and as you finish this video, be thinking about maybe your own interpretation, not only on this sense of nature versus culture, which I think is something that Hawthorne's wrestling with in this book a lot, something that I've been wrestling with a lot as I've been thinking about education. And then something more that Dimsdale's wrestling with as he clutches his own heart. What's the significance of the clutching for him?